It's such a pleasure to meet you. I have been Googling you. So many people have recommended you to be on this podcast. And I think one person in particular said, you need to speak to this woman. I'm not going to tell you what she does. Her name should speak for itself. And immediately I thought, what has this woman done? And yes, you are all over the internet. So thank you for having me this Sunday.
My pleasure.
You obviously are one of the most highly qualified people in the Clare Valley when it comes to tech. Actually, let's just broaden that and say probably one of the most highly qualified in this country, would you say? And how many years are we talking
I'd be
here?
embarrassed to say that, but I do hold a lot of credentials and I do hold a lot of influencers awards, if you like. So I guess you could say that. But as I say, I'm a little embarrassed to talk about that.
It's not
myself.
a time to be humble, Jo. This is
but
time
I
to
am.
celebrate.
I think that's part of my bush background. That's what you learn.
To be humble.
To be humble and work bloody hard.
She describes herself as a tech nerd and has since the age of 4. She's now one of the most influential people in the tech world with 25 years of knowledge in physical and cybersecurity information technology. Jo Stewart-Rattray lives in the back streets of Auburn in South Australia's Clare Valley and runs a consulting practice in technology and security, advising organisations globally. Her qualifications and experience in technology is so impressive. But she's also instrumental in getting more women involved in a male-dominated tech industry and has made some major inroads with the She Leads Tech program. Plus, she's represented Australia at the United Nations. She's focused, articulate, and a very professional leader with a passion for motivating and teaching others. This woman has an amazing story to tell, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So without further ado, enjoy the journey with Jo Stewart-Rattray.
I was only kid, so only child, grew up loving special time, particularly with my dad. And so he and I would watch television together. So that was pretty exciting, you know. That was I just loved all of the stuff about how they make film and how they do all of it. So that was sort of the beginning. I was only about 4 or 5, I suppose, and I went to a big department store. I think it was David Jones with my grandmother. And I saw these women operating these enormous accounting machines, comptometers. And I just wanted to be those women. These were beasts of machines. I wanted to be the woman who was responsible for something like that.
Okay, how old were you at this point?
4 or 5.
4 or 5. So when did you make that next step of, okay, was it high school? Was it a university?
No, I decided that I was going to be a doctor.
Oh.
Well, that was fine until I went and stayed with a friend of my grandmother's on their farm, who, of course, I called Auntie and Uncle. Went and stayed with Auntie and Uncle on their farm, and I went with her when she lopped the head off a goose and started to prepare it for a meal. And that was it. I almost passed out at 8 and was so ill with the idea of blood and guts. And when she's, literally gutting the bird, it was like, maybe I should change my mind. So I went through a period of time having no idea.
So you weren't going to be a chef or a butcher either then?
No. Oh, no. So I don't think I actually had a real idea until I was somewhat older. And I suddenly realised that I still wanted to be involved. I went in and worked in radio, broadcast radio for some years.
For who?
5KA here in Adelaide, 2UW in Sydney. And so it was...
And where did you grow up initially? Was it Victoria?
I was born in country Victoria, and the first part of my life was in country Victoria, literally the one-horse town. And then we moved to South Australia when I was a little kid, sort of 8-ish, I suppose. And then when I was about 17, I flew the coop and and lived in Sydney. So Sydney became my home for a long, long time.
So what did your parents do?
My dad was a carpenter builder, and my mother was a homebody, whatever the word was back then. I think she was, a domestic goddess or something. But thinking of my mother as a goddess is probably, not right either.
So you flew the Coop at 17 and headed to Sydney.
Yeah, I did.
And what was the plan there?
I was working in radio.
Okay.
Broadcast radio was still the thing for me at that point. I actually went into public relations too for a while. You know, it was always around that entertainment management. I was responsible for logistics for a number of bands and a number of large tours. Lots of funny stories about that. And again, you see, there's always that technology element. All of this has a technology element to it.
So when you were in radio, was it the technology that interested you more so than the speaking?
Oh, I think so, because my first gig was actually in the newsroom on the weekend switching. So I was switching between football, and I was taping segments of football to be replayed.
So you were in the control room.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite that glamorous though, really. It was, stuck in the back of the newsroom on Franklin Street. And I used to read news and weather to the regionals. So again, that's about switching broadcast to the regionals. I'm actually now chair of Channel 44. So,
really?
So I still have kept that
just
that
something else, to add to the the CV of volunteer organisations that you've committed yourself to.
That's right. So there was always that technology flavour with all of that, and it wasn't really until I was in my late 20s, in fact, when I really got seriously involved in. So I was late to it, but it had always been there. And so it was from then I did some formal study and, blah, blah. So did all of that and went down that path of seriously pursuing tech. Particularly, I started pursuing tech when I was living in Germany, and then when I came back to Australia, it was full on into tech.
So, which decade are we talking? Is this during the 80s that you?
80s.
So, how big was tech in the 80s, and how common was it for women to go into tech in the 80s?
It's interesting. In the 80s, there were quite a lot of women in tech. Something happened though, come the 90s, and we seem to have lost a lot of women in tech. I don't know what happened. I was talking to a colleague of mine who's actually an American, and he said in the 80s he had college professors who were women in tech, and then all of a sudden what happened? It seemed to be we'd taken the eye off the ball as far as feminism and as far as women getting into less traditional roles.
Is it because the industry of tech has got a reputation of being sitting in dungeons and looking at computer screens and doesn't have that?
Of course, and we still fight. We're
it?
Still in 2022. We're still fighting that. We still have an underrepresentation of women in the tech workforces, and particularly in security, and particularly in tech leadership and security leadership. So, and I think that's true. There is this notion of women not wanting to be in that testosterone-fueled world of hoodie-wearing young men in dungeons who perhaps haven't bathed often enough. Unfortunately, I've heard stories from young women today, because I obviously mentor a lot of women, and I have mentored a lot of women. And, young women have said to me, not just in this country, but across the world, that they find that off-putting. They want to see other like faces. So they want to see women's faces.
Oh, so they're intimidated.
I don't know that it's intimidated so much. It can be, but I think it's just not comfortable when you're the only woman in the room. Now, that's been my professional career, essentially, whether it was in entertainment or whether it was in tech. That's been my life. I'm often the only woman in the boardroom.
What was it that appealed to you when you first started out in that career?
I think that might have also been part of it, was to break the glass ceiling. And I always tell the story, if I'm asked about, do you believe there's a glass ceiling? I'll say, no, it's not a glass ceiling. It's a granite ceiling. But my dad always taught me how to use a jackhammer.
I like that.
Yeah. So I think that probably was part of it, because I'm a bit of an overachiever. So I would
like a challenge.
And so for me, that would be something that would make me try harder.
So what did you do? What did you do to break through that glass ceiling or granite ceiling or whatever ceiling?
I've been the best that I possibly could be. Probably more qualifications than my male colleagues, probably work longer hours than my male colleagues. All of those things have been part of it. And unfortunately, I still see women today facing that same struggle. But yes, it's to be the best that I possibly could and to achieve the most that I possibly could. Not just for me, but for and on behalf of other women.
We're going to talk about your She Leads Tech program a bit later. What has been your general role? What do you do in your line of work?
I've been, particularly in the last few years, the last 15, 20 years, I suppose. Oh, God, that's a long time. The last 15 or so years, I've been in management, senior management. I have been a chief information officer, which means responsible for all technology within an organisation. Mm-hmm. Also chief information security officer, which means responsible for all information security. And these days, information security is all pervading, because if you think about it, you might be wearing a digital watch. You might be wearing an Apple Watch. So that's part of the technology landscape that I might need to be prepared to protect. Telephones, tablets, internet-connected fridges, internet-connected vehicles, all of those things suddenly become part of my bailiwick. That's something that I have to make sure that I keep secure. So we're no longer talking about just protecting the corporate network, the corporate technology network, but we're talking about protecting the data that resides or passes across that network. So that means I have to actually be responsible for all of those things, because they might all be connected to my network. It might be the air conditioning system is connected. My colleagues in the facilities team might have those sort of things, or CCTV, closed circuit television, might be connected. So I'm responsible for the security of all of that within an organisation.
Well, that's massive.
It is massive.
Especially with so much, with technology just expanding at a rapid rate.
So anything that's a potential hackable device, I'm responsible for, although I have drawn the line at being responsible for the CEO's pacemaker, because that too is a hackable device, right? But I'm not going to go down that path.
Are you serious?
I am serious. Anything that's digital is hackable in some way or another.
Has that even happened?
Yes. It was believed many years ago that, I think it was Dick Cheney, was the Vice President of the United States, had a very strange incident with his pacemaker. And there was some notion, whether it be true, false or indifferent, that may have been subject of a hack attack.
Speaking of hacking or hackable events, have you been in charge of been involved in an organisation that has been hacked?
From the sidelines, as a consultant, brought in after the fact to do something about it. That's always very unpleasant to have to go in, because you start to realise where the holes were. So I like to be far more proactive. I would far rather be working with an organisation to help them as much as is possible prevent that happening to them. So that's about ensuring that they have the right technology, and that the technology that they have to protect themselves is commensurate with the risk and the data that they hold. Mm. So it's about the best that you can possibly afford, and then putting the right policies in place, educating staff. I actually believe it's about communication and education, so they are aware of their rights, roles and responsibilities in relation to both technology and data.
Do organisations make it a priority to put security as a priority?
They should. It should be a security-first approach. And today we look at security and privacy in tandem. And as I've said, my colleagues in physical security, so those who are responsible for facilities and perimeters, should also be part of that landscape, as should my colleagues in risk and assurance. So it's kind of like a Venn diagram with all these pieces that fit together, and the bit in the middle is where we should all be working together.
I understand that last year cybersecurity breaches had jumped significantly. Why so? And who got hacked?
Everybody got hacked last year, I think. I mean, so many of the major names were hacked. It's Microsoft got done, Fortinet got done. So it went on. So some of the big SolarWinds, some of the big tech providers actually got hacked as well. So that to me shows that no one is impenetrable. So that's the big important thing to remember. Just because
you're 68%.
Yeah,
is that because there's more hackers out there, or people just aren't doing enough? Businesses aren't doing enough?
I think that a lot of businesses stopped spending money on tech when the pandemic came along. But of course, the bad guys don't stop. So I'm not sure that there were more hackers out there. I think what had happened is that people let their guard down. They were so concentrating on the pandemic, they actually forgot some of the other things. And there have been pandemic-related scams by the dozen, probably by the hundreds.
How much does it cost an organisation to come back from a hacking event?
Depends on the attack. It can be into the billions if you look at something like a an Equifax hack of a few years ago that was worth billions of dollars.
An Equifax?
Equifax was the name of the company, who were hacked severely, and it was certainly, it appeared as though it could have been a nation-state hack, which means that a nation-state hack is when a government is involved.
Wow.
We see nation-state hacks often. What's happened but for organisations with this kind of level of increase of hacking is that it's now becoming harder and harder for organisations to be insured against it. So cyber insurance has become so expensive, it's almost out of the realms of most organisations.
My goodness. So what would it cost?
Millions, depending on the kind of organisation. It can be millions to insure. Smaller organisations, obviously not so, but large organisations, it can cost you millions of dollars to insure against cyber hacks.
So you represent, obviously, big organisations, but you recommend all organisations, big or small?
I've worked with one-person operations all the way through to the top end of town, yes.
Okay. So do the one-person operations essentially even go down this track?
No, and they should, because particularly if they have something that is particularly theirs, right? So they might have developed something, they might have created something that they really don't want other people to have, or they've researched something. So you need to consider, what do you have? And it goes back to what I said earlier, that you need to insure yourself by having the right technologies and softwares in place, but that is within your cost bracket, and you have to look at, is it commensurate with the risk? It's no point spending $1,000 on protecting yourself if you've only got $10 worth of data, right? So that's what you have to look at. How much is this worth to me? So how much am I prepared to pay to protect it?
Now, you've spoken that you've worked in electricity, you've worked in high-end tourism, but if you can pinpoint one role in particular that you really enjoyed or was a highlight for you, what would be that role?
I think they've all had their advantages. That's the interesting thing about it. They've all had their advantages. And it's the same, consulting is a really interesting world to live in as well, because when you think about it, that you're dealing with organisations, you go in, you do a job, you give them the recommendations, you help them through understanding those recommendations, and then you walk away. That's actually quite hard to walk away from it. But they're the people who will call you back and say, oh, Jo, can you give us a bit of help with this? So you end up by forming career-long relationships with organisations and people. So that to me is pretty special as well.
And do you do this all from the comfort of your own home in Auburn?
I have not been into the Silver Chain corporate office except for 2 short visits since the 17th of March 2020, and I've only been into the BRM advisory office maybe 4 or 5 times since then. So yeah, essentially it all happens here. This is the nerve centre that you're sitting in this morning.
Well, isn't that just ideal?
It's fabulous, and I never ever thought that I would be able to do that. I'd always thought that I needed other people around. All I can say is thank goodness the pandemic has come when it has, because we now have the technology to allow us to do this. If it had even been 5 years ago, we did not have the technology that was affordable, accessible, and give us the ability to actually still be able to communicate and collaborate with our peers.
Well, on that, with so many people connecting online through Zoom calls, different ways of communicating, has that opened up another level of cybersecurity from your perspective?
Of course.
And are those platforms protected as much as they should be?
There was a whole lot of kerfuffle at the beginning of the pandemic about what was secure and what wasn't, and all of those providers have lifted their game.
Okay.
And so I quite frankly think that it's now seriously like making a phone call, because that's 4G, or it could be an internet-provided phone service. So all of those are hackable, but with so many people on Zoom or on Teams or whatever else, the hackers would have to be really keen to want to actually get into some of that. Some of the calls I have, really, I can't imagine them being particularly excited by them.
When I was finding out a lot about you, what really sparked my interest, apart from everything that you've achieved in tech, was your role in trying to get more women, as we talked about previously, into the world of tech, and that you had the chance to be as part of an Australian delegation to America to try and boost the amount of women to be leaders in tech as well as be involved in the industry. How did that all come to be?
Again, I've been involved with professional bodies in the technology space, ISACA, the Australian Computer Society, etc. So I've always been involved with those bodies because I think you start at the grassroots to try and encourage there to be more women. I've always said I wanted more lipstick and heels in the boardroom. And that's only figurative, of course. I don't actually care if women wear lipstick and heels or not. But I just want to see more women in the boardroom, and I want to see more young women stepping up alongside of me to work with us to achieve. So, it goes back to I was a child and I watched a movie with Audrey Hepburn, and she was working at the UN and she was making a difference. And I thought, I want to do that. I was 7, 8, something like that. I said, that's what I want to do. And so I held that dream all of my life thinking it'll never happen. Right. I had been the global volunteer founder for ISACA's She Leads Tech program, which is aimed at ensuring women have a fair go in tech, and indeed that we increase the numbers of women in the top leadership ranks. I've had the great privilege of rolling that particular program out personally in 16 countries around the world, and it's now in 180. I'm absolutely delighted that at the work we continue to do.
And have you seen a difference in the amount of women?
I've seen is the ability that women now have. They feel that She Leads Tech has created safe spaces for them to tell their stories. Because when I was in Africa, for instance, I heard some horrendous stories of things that women have to put up with, both personally and in the workforce. So,
like what? Can you?
Sure. There was an amazing CIO, a female CIO I heard speak, and I had the privilege of meeting, who had been in a forced marriage as a young, barely a woman, essentially. And she had managed to run away from that, incredibly brave. And she had, at 40 years old, had finally married for love and had her first child. But it was a horrendous story to get her to that point. So, when I say safe places, I seriously mean safe places for women to be able to share their stories together, which actually provides strength to one another. And you realise that you can do it together. I am a great believer in the sisterhood. I do believe that we have greater strengths together. So through all of that, I was hosting a She Leads Tech luncheon in Canberra in 2017. I had made the statement that I would like to see She Leads Tech, with feet under the table with the Australian Ambassador for Women and Girls. I would also like to be dealing with people like UN Women, because there's a lot of similar traction and synergy there. We could get some real rubber on the road if we did that. So this woman came up to me who was from Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and said, Jo, I know you're racing for a plane and I'm racing to a meeting, but I'm going to send you a link to an opportunity that you must promise me you'll throw your hat in the ring for.
Wow.
So I went, yeah, sure, okay, Sandra, not a problem. So, I got on the aircraft, came home. I am one of the people who stands up when you get to the other end because I'm a bit antsy and it's nice to actually stand up. And so I just turned my phone on and there was the text bing, and I had a look and I went, and I have to tell you, I'm sure I said it out loud. I went, I can't do that, because the man in front of me turned around and looked at me. So it must have been my inside voice coming out. And it was this opportunity to put in a submission to potentially be selected to be part of the official Australian government delegation to the 62nd session of the Commission on the Status of Women. So I went through the whole process and eventually, and there's a long and involved story as to how it happened, but I was eventually selected only one of 2 people who were from civil society to go to the UN.
That would have been difficult to even get into that delegation. How many people would have been?
I believe there were over 150 people had actually put their hands up. So I was extremely lucky. The Commission has a theme every session, and the theme was the empowerment of rural women and girls through the use of technology. So you can see my sweet spot. So I was an advisor to the delegation. So I was working with our top level diplomats, the Minister for Women, 3 ambassadors, and our permanent negotiating staff at the United Nations. So it was an extraordinary experience to actually work for nearly 3 weeks alongside of those people actively at the UN to make a difference for women and girls across the world, because every point that you make must be agreed by 193 member states. My hat goes off to our diplomats. We have an extraordinary team, and I have to say that if I had my time over again, I might have changed my career options and thought about working in international engagement, or indeed to work as a peacekeeper for the United Nations.
Why is it too late now? You've taken a couple of steps towards that already.
I have, and I will continue to do my work through. I'm now on the board of the National Rural Women's Coalition, so we continue that international engagement for Australian women every year. So we are part of that United Nations landscape. In fact, I was working with a colleague on the draft conclusions for this next session, which is in March this year. So
you've been overseas to the UN a number of times now, but the first time was your highlight.
The first time was absolutely my highlight.
Why was that?
New and exciting and part of a lifelong dream. And my lifelong dream had come true. I actually remember talking to a colleague, an ISACA colleague who was interviewing me to put up on their website about this amazing journey. I actually burst into tears. We don't cry in security usually, but I burst into tears and said, oh my God, my dream is going to come true. And it did come true when I walked onto the floor of the General Assembly in the United Nations.
How terrified would you have been? Were you nervous?
It's kind of funny. I had to go to a board meeting in Nashville, Tennessee before I went to the UN. So I was actually still kind of mulling over what had happened at the board meeting when I arrived in New York. And I got to the hotel and there was a stuff up with my room and it was like, I can't believe it. And so it wasn't until I was getting ready to go to the ambassadors to be greeted by the ambassador at her residence that I suddenly went, oh, hell, this is happening. And I suddenly became incredibly nervous. And so when I was introduced to the ambassador and I was, she was asking me a few questions and ambassador this, ambassador that, she said, oh, for goodness sake, Jo, please just call me Jillian when we're alone. You don't have to. And it was like, oh my God. And it suddenly dawned on me that these incredible people that I was with are just human beings like you and me. So that was such a highlight, and also to be part of the negotiating team, because I was their technical advisor. So they'd turn around, because we worked all hours of the day and night. We might have the chief negotiator might turn around to me and say, Jo, when you think of infrastructure, what does it mean to you? And so I would have to give her an answer immediately. We also have the Australian contingent who are outside, because they can't come into the negotiating room. They're outside in the hallways waiting for questions from us. So there might be a technical question come up that I can't answer, that's not in my realm. An example was, at what point does personhood begin? So I raced out knowing we had a human rights lawyer out there.
What does that mean?
I'll tell you.
Okay.
So raced out there, found Helen, said, when does personhood begin? Personhood begins the moment a baby draws breath in the open air. Because when we talk...
Why would someone ask you that question?
Because it's holistic. We look at literally cradle to grave for women and girls. So it's women and girls in all their diversity, and we're looking at it, how can technology help a mother who's pregnant, for instance? So that's why we ask the question about personhood. And so you need to understand the answer to what that is. So,
what was the most controversial or trickiest question that you've ever been asked? Apart from the personhood one, that was kind of tricky.
That was tricky. I guess was not to do with the UN. It was after my UN journey, and I was at an event, and I was asked by a quite elderly gentleman what was my personal opinion and the position held by the UN on female genital mutilation.
Did you have to sit and think about that, or you just knew?
No, I knew what I felt, and I certainly knew the UN position because, I'd only been back from the UN a matter of weeks when that happened. So I was able to answer that question without even thinking about it really. But I sort of thought the question was asked to throw me off kilter. I said that we actually call it harmful practices in UN terms because it is a harmful practice against women. And every year that question is asked, and it is agreed by 193 member states that it needs to be addressed. So that's generally part of the roadmap, because at the end of each session there's a roadmap for countries to follow for the next 6 years, and every year they have to come back and be accountable for that for their actions against it. And of course, it's something that will damage a woman psychologically and socially for the rest of her life, potentially, not to mention the physical damage. And unfortunately, it does happen even in this country, even though it is illegal here.
Does it?
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you said, okay, so it needs to be addressed, and then there's a roadmap for these countries that they need to go down and come back in 5 or 6 years and see if they've actually achieved that. Okay, 5-6 years down the track, I know that you haven't been part of it for that long, or maybe you have.
4 years now.
So not totally towards the end of that road, but do countries do anything about it?
Yes, they do. Liberia, the outgoing president of Liberia, Mrs. Johnson, Ellen Leaf Johnson, I believe, she, as one of her last actions, made female genital mutilation and forced marriage illegal. And that was a very brave thing for her to do, and I understand why she left it to nearing the end of her term. I think it was simply because she needed to get the groundswell, confidence in her and her abilities, and then make that stand and statement. So yes, it does happen. And every year, each country is actually held accountable to what they've done against the roadmap. So they come back and that's when the ministers for women have to stand and make a country statement on the floor of the UN. And that is to what have we achieved since our last visit, essentially.
Who is the Australian representative with the UN?
Mitch Fifield is the current ambassador. Last ambassador that I had a lot to do was Gillian Bird, Ambassador Bird.
So how do you become a professional diplomat?
You do international engagement at university, or you do international law, and so you then hope to get an internship with with DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Being a diplomat it's actually hard work. You're posted all around the world for 3 years at a time. The chief negotiator at my first time at the UN was an amazing woman who that was going to be her last commission because she was being posted to Pakistan. So you could be sent anywhere.
Would that have been something that you would have loved to have done?
Oh, of course. That's why I say I think
I wanted to do that when I was
right.
younger.
I think
because it sounded glamorous, I think. But
I think if I had it, yes. Or, as I say, a UN peacekeeper, because we know that women peacekeepers make a real difference in areas of conflict. Truces and ceasefires are likely to last longer if a woman has negotiated it with other women. So that's an interesting point too.
Okay. So, Jo, out of everything that you have done, what are you truly most proud of?
I think I'm most proud of my engagement with the UN and with She Leads Tech. I think they're the two things that really are standouts for me because I'm doing what I wanted to do as a 7-year-old child. I'm helping other women and girls by quietly making a difference in the background.
And I don't know do you know what the take-up is now of women getting into tech since you started this She Leads Tech program?
Interestingly, the take-up is, the take-up of women and girls into tech isn't the issue. It's where they go to and how soon we lose them. That's
because
the issue.
of pregnancy and things like that?
Well, not necessarily. It's because oftentimes it can be because there's definitely pay inequity. There's also, as we know, there's gender inequity. Inclusion is an issue. So all of those things that we're trying to stamp out make a difference.
What is the pay inequity at the moment?
Between 17 to 23%.
Wow.
Depending on where you are in the world.
So you've been in the industry for a very long time. Are you battling pay inequity?
Yes.
Still?
Yes.
How do you battle that? How do you try and get over that hump?
I've left jobs when I've discovered. I found on a photocopier one day, a printer. I found the salary scales of various individuals, and I looked at it and I found a male less qualified than me in a role junior to me was making $30,000 a year more than me. I didn't stay there for very much longer.
No, don't
I
blame
waited my opportunity to find another job and then I left.
Yeah. Yep. So you never approached your boss?
Yeah, of course.
And what did he say?
Was about the answer. There's always an excuse. There's always an excuse.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's frustrating.
Even if I'm not battling it on behalf of myself, I'm battling it on behalf of other women.
Exactly. Exactly. How did you end up in Auburn?
That's an interesting question too. James and I were looking to get out of Sydney. It had become...
Oh, so you met James in Sydney?
No, I met him here actually.
Oh, you met...
Oh, that's a whole other long story. Anyway.
Okay.
James and I...
It's for another podcast episode.
I think so. I'd been overseas and I went back to live in Sydney. And James and I were just beginning to realise that Sydney was becoming big, dirty and incredibly expensive. And this is more than 20 years ago. And it was just a case of it's too much. And so we had friends here in the valley and we kept coming down and we found ourselves coming down more and more often. And we were heading back to the airport and they said, oh, look, we'll show you some land that's for sale. So we did a drive-by. In fact, the real estate agent was picking up a for sale sign on the first 2 blocks. And so James jumped out of the car and spoke to him, got his card. And when we got home, he rang and we made an offer. We had the 5-year plan, it was going to be 5 years and then we'd come down here. And then we were talking about what we were going to do with these blocks when we were down here again, visiting friends, and decided to find out if the other 2 blocks were available. And sure enough, the people who owned them wanted to sell them. So we went, beautiful. So we bought those. And by this stage, it was like a 3-year plan we had left. And we went, let's just do it. James had actually taken a real job.
Okay, so James is a musician.
He is a musician, but he took a real job for a little while and went and worked for the government wearing we laugh about this, wearing his Yves Saint Laurent suit. It was all of a sudden, it was a bit of a shock to the system. And he got a transfer down here. And so he got a transfer that made it so much easier for us to move. So we moved down and we lived in Adelaide for a year while we built this place, then moved up here and have been very happy ever since. And then he decided enough is enough after a few years and went back to the music business because that's where his first love is.
Give it your best shot, no second chance. Seize the moment shaped by circumstance. Only this time might just be the wrong time. Like Mona Lisa hiding behind that smile, you can't forget and you'll never forgive that boy who was driving you crazy.
How many countries have you travelled to around the world?
I counted it up recently. It's about 43.
43.
Yeah.
Wow. So out of everywhere you visited, what's the top of the list?
That's also a really hard question because some places are just beautiful for different reasons. I actually adore the southwest of the United States. James and I had the very great privilege of spending time in the Navajo Nation, and I would say that is one of the top draw experiences of my life just because you're in the high desert country and the stories, the First Nations stories are just extraordinary there. So that's probably my number one place as far as natural extraordinary beauty is concerned. But there are other places that I loved. I loved it when I went to Mauritius. I absolutely loved the calamity that is India.
I was going to ask you about India because is India still considered like the tech capital of the world?
Well, yes. Kind of, but it's funny when you're actually in Mumbai in a little restaurant and they're doing what looks like interpretive dance to try and get a Wi-Fi signal. It did make me laugh, and I thought, and this is where we outsource everything to. It was quite amusing. So it is a calamity. It is chaos. It's if you saw some of the wiring, you'd go, oh my gosh. It was a great experience. It was a have-to-have experience. So would I go back on a holiday? Probably not, but I loved the experience. I would go to Sri Lanka. In a heartbeat, beautiful, beautiful place. And then, of course, there are some of the extraordinary countries in Europe. And we have great friends in the UK. Scotland is a place that I adore. I'd be happy to pat up stumps and go to Scotland, or even probably more so, go and live on Dartmoor in Devon. A little bluestone cottage with the Moors ponies around you and being able to see anybody coming towards you for miles. And if you don't want to, you can just close the door.
Speaking of which, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Oh, still at the desk.
So not in Devon? Not in Devon then?
No. I mean, the reality of it is I think these days you work for as long as you want and for as long as you can, because none of us want to eat into our savings particularly. Also, work for me is pleasure too. So I don't want to give that up easily. So I will certainly work for as long as I feel I can, and for as long as I feel that I'm giving something back to an organisation or indeed to other people.
I must say, I've loved your story.
Thank
and
you.
I think I got more out of it than I anticipated. I find it fascinating, and I just love how I found you in down a side street at the back of Auburn, and it's been such a pleasure. So thank you, Jo, for spending your Sunday with me.
Thank you, Annabelle. It's been lovely.
Jo Stewart-Rattray. She speaks so well, doesn't she? I could listen to her all day. And what an amazing career she's had. It blows my mind, the talent that you find in our little valley, nestled in the mid-north of South Australia. It continually surprises me. If you enjoyed this podcast, like it, rate it, review it. The more reviews the podcast gets, the more it will climb up the charts. And I'm excited to share that this podcast has had over 7,000 downloads or listens. I am so happy. So thank you for everybody that's listened. So with that in mind, I'm putting out a challenge. The podcast is celebrating its first birthday next month, the month of May. And my aim is to get to 10,000 downloads by then. Can you help me? Please share this episode with your networks. Let's get to 10,000. It will be the best birthday present ever. I'm Annabelle Homer. Let's chat soon. And on a side note, that piece of music you heard during the interview was written and produced by James Stewart-Rattray, which is Jo's husband, from Desert Dog Productions. Thank you, James, for allowing us to hear your music.